Hi there, I'm a historian. If you're having trouble sleeping tonight, I think my story might just help you drift off. For now, all you need to do is close your eyes. And if you have headphones nearby, go ahead and put them on. Let my voice and the sound of rain carry you gently into sleep. Now, then let's begin. The sound came first, sharp, familiar, and unrelenting. It was the clack of hobnailed sandals on packed earth, the rattle of armor being tightened, and the low thump of a shield dropped against the wall. Even before Marcus Flavius opened his eyes, the noise painted the scene in his mind. Another day at the edge of the empire. Another day in the Roman army. Cold air wrapped around him like a damp cloak. His skin prickled against the rough wool blanket. The barracks were dark, but alive. Dozens of bodies moving in practiced rhythm, dressing, grumbling, preparing. Outside, the frost hung low over the fortress of Castra Vetera, a sprawling military outpost on the wild northern border near Germania. To the locals, this was the edge of the world. To Rome, it was a line that must never break. Marcus sat up slowly, back sore from the stone-hard bunk, and reached for his tunic. It was stiff from dried sweat and days of grime. He pulled it over his head with a grunt. The man next to him, Gaius, a veteran with 14 years' service and a half-missing ear, nodded once, saying nothing. They rarely spoke in the morning. There was no need. Boots belt dagger, then the lorica segmentata, the iconic plated armor of the Roman legionary. Marcus strapped it on, feeling its weight settle over his chest like a second skin. It was uncomfortable. It was loud. It was survival. The centurion's voice roared through the barracks like a thunderclap. Form up, standard inspection. The soldiers shuffled out into the frigid air, forming neat lines in the yard. Breath steamed from their nostrils. The standard and eagle of bronze gleamed in the gray morning light, held aloft by the signifer, its banner barely fluttering in the frozen wind. Marcus took his place. Eyes ahead, hands still tingling with cold. The centurion paced in front of them, a scarred man named Lucullus, who had once fought in Dacia and still walked with a limp. His vine staff slapped into his palm rhythmically. Clean weapons, proper dress. Your soldiers of Rome, not Gallic pig farmers. He stopped in front of Marcus, stared him down, then moved on. No word. A good sign. After inspection came the march. They marched every day, even if there was no battle. It kept their bodies hard, their minds sharper. Today was 5 miles up the hill and through the forest, where Germanic eyes sometimes watched from behind trees. Marcus kept his gaze forward, ignoring the ache in his shoulders, the pinch in his boots. The column moved like a machine. 6 men across shields on the left spears pointed forward. The world smelled of pine leather and iron. After the march, they trained. Training meant sweat pain and repetition. Sword drills with wooden gladi shield formations, mock combat. Shields slammed against shields, men grunted and cursed, and the centurions barked corrections like whip cracks. Marcus fought against a younger recruit who swung too wide. He parried, stepped forward, and slammed his practice blade into the boy's gut. The air left the recruit's lungs in a grunt, and he stumbled back, wide-eyed. Better, Lucullus said, but don't get cocky. Training lasted until midday. Then came food, coarse bread, lentils, dried pork. The soldiers ate sitting on the ground backs to the barracks wall. Conversation was minimal. Energy had to be preserved. Marcus took a long sip from his wineskin, grimaced, and leaned back. The sky had begun to clear, revealing the sun in a pale, washed-out blue. He thought of home, of the red-tiled roofs of Hispania, of his mother's hands kneading dough, of the way olive trees swayed in the wind near his childhood home. He hadn't seen it in 6 years. War did not leave time for nostalgia. But on days like this quiet routine alive, it crept in anyway. Afternoon duties varied. Sometimes it was building roads, maintaining the camp walls, cleaning the latrines, sharpening weapons. Today, Marcus was assigned to sentry duty atop the palisade wall. He climbed the ladder and stepped onto the wooden walkway shield slung over his back, pylum resting at his side. From up here he could see the Rhine thick with ice at the edges. Beyond it lay Germania, untamed, unconquered, waiting. Smoke curled from the trees across the river. Villages, or maybe just fires left as warnings. Below him, the camp pulsed like a living organism. Officers moved with scrolls in hand. Slaves hauled firewood. Horses snorted in the stables. The army did not sleep during the day. It prepared. Always prepared. Marcus let out a breath and rolled his shoulders. A crow landed on the battlement beside him, watching with a dark, intelligent eye. He nodded to it, half mocking. "If you're here for news, go ask the centurion. I'm just the sword." The crow cawed once and took off. Evening would bring more drills, cleaning of weapons and formation practice by torchlight. Then dinner. Then sleep. Then morning again. A cycle of discipline. A machine of flesh and will. But even in the stillness, Marcus knew the storm was never far. The rumors had grown louder each day. The tribes across the river were stirring. The legate had received messengers. Maps were being redrawn. Supplies stockpiled. The calm would not last. And so he stood, eyes fixed on the frozen horizon, hand resting on the hilt of his blade, and waited. Because that's what a Roman soldier did. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long amber streaks across the Roman camp. A cold wind blew down from the northern forests, stirring the red banners that hung limp during the day. Below the watchtower, the murmurs of the men returning from duties echoed between stone walls and wooden roofs. Marcus Flavius descended from his post just as the horn sounded across Castra Vetera, its low, mournful tone signaling the end of day watch and the approach of evening muster. He stretched his shoulders as he walked the weight of hours in armor, pressing deep into his bones. But there was no room for rest yet. The cohort gathered once more in the training yard, dusty, half-lit by the dying sun, where their centurion awaited with folded arms. The men formed ranks, their faces lit with the quiet fatigue of routine. Marcus stood beside Gaius again, their shoulders brushing in the way of old comrades who needed no words. Lucullus paced before them, his voice calm but direct. Tomorrow the tribune arrives from Mogontiacum. There will be inspection, armor polished, weapons sharpened. Be ready or be flogged. There were no groans, no complaints, just nods. The rules of the Legion were clear, and no one tested them twice. After the briefing, the men were dismissed in pairs and small groups. Most walked toward the barracks, others to the smithy, or to the small shrine beside the eastern gate, where offerings were left to Mars and Jupiter. Marcus broke off from the main group, stepping into the armory, where oilcloth and whetstones waited. His gladius, short and brutal, made for stabbing, not slashing, was chipped from the last live combat exercise. He sat on a low bench and began the ritual every Roman soldier knew by heart. Clean the blade, sharpen the edge, oil the leather, polish the metal. Not just for war, but for pride. As he worked, two younger soldiers entered, one singing a crude song about a centurion's wife and a goat. Marcus cracked a smile, but said nothing. Gaius entered soon after and sat beside him with a sigh, laying his shield across his knees. "You hear the rumors?" Gaius asked, voice low. Marcus didn't look up. "Which one's chatty movement east of the river? Scouts say they've seen smoke. Whole villages gone quiet." Marcus exhaled slowly, wiping a streak of oil across the blade. quiet doesn't always mean empty. Gaius shrugged. Maybe, but it never means safe. The silence that followed said more than words could. They had fought before, both of them, seen what Germanic ambushes looked like, seen how fast a patrol could vanish, how a quiet night could turn red in minutes. By the time they finished, the camp was dim under torchlight. The sky was a deep navy blue, the stars just beginning to show. From the far end of camp came the smells of the evening meal, barley stew, baked flatbread, and the ever-present vinegar wine. The two men walked side by side to the mess tent, where rows of soldiers sat cross-legged on benches, bowls in hand, voices low and scattered. Marcus ate slowly. He savored every bite. Not because it was good, it wasn't, but because in war you learn to respect food. It meant you were alive. He glanced around the tent. A few men laughed, some argued over dice. Others stared into their bowls in thought. Every man here had a different past, some farmers, others criminals, some born into the army. But now they were all the same, legionaries, tools of Rome. After the meal came what little free time they had. Some men played board games with pieces carved from bone. Others polished gear, wrote letters to wives they hadn't seen in years, or carved small tokens from wood. Marcus preferred quiet. He walked to the shrine near the gate, lit a small oil lamp, and placed a bronze coin on the altar. For fortune, he whispered. He didn't know if the gods listened, but every man needed something to believe in. Back in the barracks, the fire crackled low. The room was dark but warm, filled with the quiet rustle of sleep preparation. Marcus sat on his bunk, rubbing his calves with oil to ease the tightness. Gaius laid down, without a word, already drifting. Marcus stared at the ceiling for a long time. His thoughts wandered not to bloodshed or glory, but to home, what little he remembered. He wondered if his younger brother had taken over the farm, if his father's olive press still worked, if they thought of him, or if time had folded over his absence like a sheet over a forgotten object. Suddenly, outside, a horn sounded short, sharp, urgent. Every man in the barracks froze. Marcus sat up. A moment passed. Then the door opened and a junior officer entered. All ranks to muster yard. Now. No explanation, just movement. They scrambled into armor, half-dressed eyes wide with confusion, but trained discipline overriding panic. In minutes, the yard filled with clanking steel and hurried footsteps. The centurion stood atop the steps near the command tent. Recon patrol from the eastern sector failed to return, Lucullus announced. Last report placed them 2 miles from the river. We move at first light, sleep in gear, swords sharp. A murmur rolled through the soldiers. Marcus said nothing. He knew what this meant. Patrols didn't just vanish. Tomorrow, the calm would break. The morning came too soon. The barracks were silent, save for the soft clink of metal and leather. No shouts, no commands, just the low rhythm of soldiers preparing for something they couldn't name, but understood deep in their bones. Marcus Flavius tightened the straps of his cuirass in the flickering light of an oil lamp. Outside, the camp was cloaked in thick fog, the kind that wrapped around your ankles like chains and turned every tree into a ghost. By the time the horn sounded, every man in the second cohort was already awake. They gathered in the yard, 50-strong armor-strapped packs light. Centurion Lucullus stood at the front, his helmet under one arm, eyes sharp and unreadable. "We march east," he said, voice steady. "Patrol failed to return. Our orders are simple: find them, bring back what we can, and remind the forest who commands this land." The standard-bearer raised the eagle high, and the cohort moved out, shields slung over backs. Gladi sheathed pila in hand. The gate creaked open, and the cold breath of the Germanic woods spilled into the camp like a warning. Marcus walked in the second line beside Gaius. Neither of them spoke. In this mist, even whispers felt too loud. They marched in silence. Every step into the forest was like stepping into another world. The ground was slick with dew and rotting leaves. The towering pines loomed above like ancient gods. Somewhere far off, a raven cawed. No birdsong, no wind, just footsteps and breath. After an hour, they reached the first sign: broken branches, boot prints in the mud. A discarded shield half sunk in the earth. Lucullus raised a fist. The cohort halted. Marcus knelt beside the shield. It was Roman, but scratched and dented. No blood, no body. Form wedge, Lucullus ordered. The men shifted formation, shields angled, pila ready. The silence deepened. They found the first corpse 15 minutes later. He was lying face down near a stream, his back black with dried blood. Marcus rolled him over. His throat had been cut clean, too clean for a tribal ambush. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. A few feet away, two more bodies, one missing an arm, the other riddled with arrows. Marcus frowned. This wasn't a skirmish. No, Gaius agreed. This was a message. Lucullus called for a perimeter. The men fanned out in a circle, shields up, eyes scanning the trees. The mist swirled around them like a living thing. Then they heard it. A whisper, not human, not natural. It came from the trees, from everywhere. A soft chant, barely audible. Lucullus raised his sword. Shields. They locked together in a testudo, shields overhead and around, crouched in a moving wall of iron. Something moved through the trees. A shadow. Then another. And then nothing. No attack came. Just silence. After an hour, they recovered what they could: 6 bodies, broken weapons, and no answers. Lucullus made the call, returned to camp. They moved fast, nerves fraying with each step. Back at Castra Vetera, the tension was a new armor. No one joked. No one sang. The dead were laid out with coins on their eyes. A priest came and muttered prayers to Jupiter, to Mars, even to Pluto, hedging bets in case the gods were feeling particular that day. That night, Marcus sat alone outside the barracks, staring into the fire pit. Gaius joined him, tossing a stick into the flames. They weren't killed in a fight, Marcus said. No, Gaius agreed. They were hunted. They sat in silence, watching the flames crackle. In the distance, a wolf howled. The next day came quickly. Another march, another inspection, another reminder that even in routine death lingered close. But it was during afternoon drills that the messenger arrived. He came on horseback, mud-splattered and wild-eyed. He dismounted before the command tent and was rushed inside. Minutes later, Lucullus emerged, face pale. All officers. Briefing. Now. Marcus watched them go, stomach heavy. That evening, orders came down, every man to sleep in gear. Weapons sharpened, rations packed. A full cohort was to move east at dawn. War was coming. And Marcus Flavius, just a soldier in 1,000, knew the peace of the iron morning was gone. Tomorrow they would walk into the forest again, not as rescuers, but as an army. At first light, the gates of Castra Vetera groaned open again. 120 legionaries stepped into the mist-draped woods led by Lucullus and his junior officers. Shields gleamed in the dull gray morning, and the sound of their boots on damp soil echoed like distant drums of war. Among them was Marcus Flavius Gladius, strapped, tight eyes, sharp mind, already moving through battle drills. He didn't feel fear. He felt focus. A readiness forged by repetition, by years under the Roman standard, by 100 drills for a moment just like this. They moved in silence, broken only by the calls of officers and the soft thud of marching. The land ahead was familiar, but different now. The trees no longer whispered. They watched. The sun struggled through clouds like a wounded god. Around mid-morning, they reached the stream where the first bodies had been found. Lucullus gave the signal to stop. Scouts moved ahead. Marcus crouched near a ridge with Gaius and 2 others. His fingers traced the notches on his gladius hilt, each one a battle survived. There were 9. "I plan to make it 10, he muttered. Gaius raised an eyebrow. Superstition insurance. Minutes passed. Then, without sound or signal, a javelin flew from the trees. It struck the scout on the ridge through the neck. He dropped without a sound. Then came the roar, deep, guttural, human, and yet wild. Dozens of figures surged from the woods. The chatty. Faces painted. Fur cloaks soaked in rain. They carried axes, crude spears, and fire-hardened clubs. But they moved with purpose. With hate. "Form ranks," Lucullus shouted. The legionaries did what they were trained to do. They locked shields. They angled their piela. They became a wall. The charge crashed into them like a wave against a stone. Marcus drove his pilum into the chest of a charging warrior, then drew his gladius in one motion. Around him, the world exploded into chaos. Shouts, screams, steel clashing on bone, the wet sound of blood meeting earth. He fought on instinct. Thrust step block. The shield absorbed a hammer blow. His gladius responded with a stab beneath the ribs. Gaius was beside him, back to back. The enemy was fast, reckless, angry. But Roman discipline held. Then, from the corner of his eye, Marcus saw it, a second wave emerging from the right flank, circling. They were being surrounded. Right flank collapse in Lucullus bellowed. But it was too late. The second wave slammed into the side of the formation. The testudo shattered. Men fell. Screams rose. Marcus found himself pulled into the melee. He was no longer in formation. He was alone. An axe scraped across his helmet, knocking him sideways. A knee to the stomach. A headbutt. He fell into the mud, rolled, slashed upward. The warrior above him gurgled and dropped. He scrambled to his feet. Gaius was gone. So were a dozen others. All around, pockets of fighting blurred into madness. The trees pulsed red and brown. The air was filled with iron and earth and blood. And then, just as quickly, it began to end. The chatty broke off. Not retreated, evaporated. Faded back into the trees with eerie coordination. Gone. Silence again. Lucullus stood panting, his left arm, bleeding, his face smeared with mud. Sound recall, he growled. The horn blew. The survivors gathered. Less than 100 remained standing. Some carried the wounded. Some simply stared wide-eyed, as if waking from a fever dream. Marcus stood heart-racing hands, shaking. He had killed. Again. And nearly been killed. "Check the ridge," Lucullus ordered. "Count the dead." They had lost 23. Another 14 too injured to march. The rest were silent. And then Gaius staggered through the mist, limping, face bruised, but alive. "You always get the good stories," he said with a grim smile. Marcus exhaled and offered him a hand. They made camp not far from the stream. Defensive perimeter. Fires low. The wounded were laid out, bandaged, fed what could be spared. That night, no one spoke of victory. Because it wasn't one. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He stared up at the stars beyond the tree canopy, counting each one like a prayer. Not to the gods, to memory. To make this day real. To make it mean something. He thought of his brother, of home, of Rome. Then he sat up and sharpened his blade. Tomorrow they would march again. Because that was what soldiers did. Not for glory. Not even for Rome. But because it was the only thing they knew how to do. They marched back in silence. There was no triumph in their footsteps, only weight of shields, of exhaustion, of memory. The woods seemed darker now, the air heavier. Every branch reminded them of the ambush. Every rustle, a ghost of the fallen. Marcus Flavius walked near the center helmet, tucked under his arm, dried blood on his armor, and Gaius beside him, limping but alive. Neither spoke. Words felt too loud, too small for what they'd seen. The forest swallowed sound, leaving only the rhythm of marching feet and the faint wheeze of the wounded being carried. By the time the gates of Castra Vetera came into view, the sun was low and red, casting long shadows that seemed to mock their return. Legionaries at the gate stared in grim silence as the cohort entered, smaller, dirtier, older than when it had left. No fanfare, no horn. Just the dull thud of boots on packed dirt and the look of understanding in the eyes of every man who had seen battle before. Lucullus ordered the men to the barracks, then to the baths if they could walk. Medical tents were filled within minutes. The rest were sent to the chapel. Marcus stripped off his armor in silence, each piece falling to the floor with a clank that echoed louder than any war cry. The smell of sweat iron and old blood filled the room. His hands trembled as he washed the dirt from his skin. But it wasn't the grime he wanted to cleanse, it was the feeling. In the chapel, incense burned. A young priest of Mars stood at the altar murmuring blessings over the names of the fallen. No elaborate rites. Just a list read aloud, each name etched into memory, if not marble. Publius Severus, Gnaeus Valens, Lucius Cassius. Marcus listened, jaw clenched. When they reached Decimus, the boy from 2 tents down, who had once joked about retiring in Hispania, Marcus closed his eyes. Afterward, back at the barracks, rations were passed around. Cold bread, lentils, water. No wine tonight, no celebrations. Gaius sat across from Marcus, bandaged and tired. "We held formation," he said at last. Marcus nodded. "Barely. We did our duty. Did we?" A long silence. Then Gaius chuckled bitterly. "I've been in this army 15 years, seen 3 governors, 5 centurions, 7 damn postings, and every time we lose a man, they say the same thing. He died for Rome. But Rome doesn't know his name, doesn't care." Marcus said nothing. He just stared at the oil lamp flickering beside them, casting shadows that danced like spirits on the wall. Later that night, he wandered outside the barracks. The camp was quiet, save for the distant clang of a blacksmith finishing his shift and the low hum of guards on the walls. He walked past the training field, now empty, the wooden dummies, scarred and splintered like old warriors. He sat near the watchtower, looking out into the darkness beyond the walls. The forest loomed like a great beast, patient and hungry. Somewhere out there, the chatty were regrouping, planning, waiting. Marcus reached into his satchel and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, an old letter from his brother in Rome. It spoke of vineyards, of politics, of a woman Marcus would never meet. A different world. He folded it back carefully. Then, from the tower above, a horn blew just once. All clear. He stood slowly and made his way back to the barracks. In the end, a Roman soldier didn't rest. He endured. Because battles came and went, but the camp remained. The drills continued. The rules held. The Republic, then the Empire. It all depended on men like him to keep marching, to keep holding the line. As Marcus crawled into his cot, the cold stone beneath him, he whispered a silent vow, not to Mars or Jupiter or any god, but to the man beside him, and the man beside that. Tomorrow he would rise again, train again, fight again, not for glory, but because that was what it meant to wear the eagle. The bugle call that sliced through the cold morning was not just a sound, it was a sentence. A reminder that the bloodshed of yesterday changed nothing. no extra rest, no exceptions. Discipline in the Roman legions was the only god more demanding than Mars himself. And so Marcus Flavius rose like the rest of them, body-aching mind, foggy but armor in hand. He dressed in silence, the muscle memory guiding his fingers as he strapped on his sandals, tightened his belt, and ran a whetstone down his gladius. Outside the barracks, the camp moved with its usual mechanical precision, centurions barking orders, servants feeding the fires, and recruits fumbling through their first steps into hell. There was no ceremony for the survivors, no nod of respect. Only fresh assignments, standard drills, and the unspoken pressure to act as though nothing had changed. Marcus joined his cohort in formation eyes, scanning the faces. Some were missing. Gaius was there, leaning heavily on one leg jaw, clenched in stubborn defiance. A few others bore fresh scars, wrapped arms, or haunted expressions, but none broke ranks. The orders today were straightforward patrol. The southern perimeter escort a grain shipment to a nearby outpost, and most insulting of all, resume training exercises for the newer recruits. As they marched out through the gate again, Marcus felt a dull weight in his chest, not grief exactly, and not fear. It was a kind of numbness. The forest was quiet this morning, eerily still, as if the trees themselves were mourning or watching or both. He caught himself scanning the branches, the ridgelines, the shadows. But there was nothing, just birdsong and the wind nudging the leaves. At the outpost, the grain handoff went without incident. A few brief words with another centurion, a signature on a wax tablet, and the transfer was done. Then it was back to Castra Vetera. The routine was familiar. The rhythm was designed to dull the mind. But today, it didn't work. Back inside the camp walls, they were assigned to assist with the midday drills. Marcus was told to oversee a line of fresh recruits, young, wiry, and overly eager. They practiced shield formations under the hot sun, stumbling into each other, shouting too loudly, holding their pila at the wrong angles. It was like watching children play soldier. Marcus barked corrections, held their shoulders, repositioned their feet. At one point, one recruit, a boy who couldn't be older than 16, asked him, "Sir, does it get easier?" Marcus stared at him for a moment. "No," he said quietly, "but you get better at pretending it does." In the evening, there was a ceremony not for the dead, but for promotion. A decanus from another cohort was being honored for his years of service. Wine was poured, bread shared, a lyre played. Marcus sat on the edge of the gathering, watching the firelight flicker across helmets and laughter. It was the strangest thing how quickly the camp could shift from grief to joy, from silence to celebration. Perhaps that was survival, or perhaps it was madness. After the ceremony, Marcus found himself wandering again, as he often did now, toward the edge of camp. There, just beyond the reach of the watchfires, the land opened into the blackness of Germania, the border between Rome and the unknown. He stood there, helmet under one arm, looking out not for enemies, but for meaning. He remembered his first battle years ago, the fear, the thrill, the adrenaline that left him shaking for hours, and then his second battle, and the third. Somewhere along the way, the fear turned into habit, the habit into identity. Now he didn't even know who he was without the armor. Behind him, the camp murmured with life. But out here, it was just the night and the questions. Was this what service meant? Was Rome still Rome when you bled for it but never saw it? Would his name ever be remembered, or just carved into some anonymous stone along a lonely frontier? And then came Gaius, limping as always, but holding a wineskin. "You thinking too loud again?" he asked. Marcus smirked faintly. "I don't know how to stop." Gaius handed him the wine. "We don't get to stop. That's not the life we picked." "I didn't pick it," Marcus said. "Then why are you still here?" A long silence passed between them, because Marcus finally said, "If I leave, I don't know who I'd be." Gaius nodded. "Then let's be soldiers, just for tonight." They sat on a fallen log, sharing the wine, watching the stars. Somewhere deep in the woods, a wolf howled. Neither man flinched, because in the end, they were legion. Not because they loved Rome, but because they had become Rome. The next morning began, like every other, too early, too cold, too quiet. But something was different. Marcus sensed it before the horn blew. Maybe it was the way the guards stood just a little stiffer at the gates, or how the usual patrol assignments hadn't been delivered with breakfast. Or maybe it was the eerie calm in the air, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. At midday, the reason became clear. A rider arrived. Dust-covered armor scorched with travel, bearing the insignia of the governor's staff. He didn't dismount, just handed a sealed scroll to the camp's legate and rode off before anyone could ask a question. Moments later, trumpets sounded not the usual cadence for drills, but something more formal. A summoning. All senior officers were ordered to the command tent. The rest of the legion was confined to quarters. Marcus wasn't high-ranking enough to enter, but his centurion was, and by mid-afternoon, whispers had begun to leak through the canvas walls like smoke. Something about a failed ambush on a Roman convoy. Something about a traitor. Something about a purge. The mood shifted instantly. The drills were canceled. Weapons were recounted. Patrols doubled. Even the cooks were questioned. A murmur moved through the camp like wind through dry grass. And then Lucullus summoned Marcus. Not with ceremony, not with escort, just a direct order report to the command tent. Inside, the atmosphere was thick. Maps stretched across tables, wax seals broken, wine untouched. 3 other soldiers stood in the tent, including Gaius, his face unusually stern. Lucullus didn't waste time. "We have a problem." He began tapping a scroll. 2 days before your ambush, a message was intercepted written in Latin sent east across the Rhine. It included troop counts, supply routes, patrol rotations. Marcus frowned. From within the legion, Lucullus nodded. "That's what we intend to find out. Starting now." What followed was a series of questions, fast and sharp. Where were you stationed on the night before the patrol? Who had access to the deployment records? Did anyone act strangely before or after the skirmish? Marcus answered calmly. So did Gaius. But it wasn't about guilt. It was about suspicion. And suspicion in a Roman camp was more dangerous than any spear. After an hour, they were dismissed. That night, nobody slept. The barracks felt colder. Shadows seemed to stretch longer. Men spoke in hushed tones. Marcus sat at the edge of his cot, staring at the wooden ceiling, thinking not about enemies in the forest, but about enemies inside the walls. Who would betray Rome from within? Why now? Who stood to gain? By the second night, one soldier had already vanished. Not arrested, not tried, just gone. His bed untouched, his armor still by the rack, but his presence erased. Everyone knew what that meant. The next morning during inspection, Lucullus announced that a formal tribunal would begin at dawn. Until then, he said flatly, no one leaves the camp, no one sends letters, and every man will report for questioning. The legion, once bound by brotherhood, began to unravel. It was in the eyes. Distrust, doubt. Men who had shared bread and blood now watched each other like strangers. Whispers bloomed like mold. Marcus kept to himself. Gaius drank more than usual, and the training fields remained empty. That night, as Marcus patrolled the wall, he saw something in the distance movement in the trees. not an army, just one figure, watching, unmoving. He blinked. It was gone. By morning, another soldier was missing, and this time it was someone from Marcus's own cohort. Lucullus didn't speak during breakfast, but the silence in his eyes was louder than any decree. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about fear. And in a Roman camp, fear was a poison that could kill more soldiers than any barbarian. The makeshift tribunal was held not in the forum, but in the camp's granary, a cold, echoing space with high timber walls and the stale scent of wheat. 3 judges sat behind a long table, Lucullus himself, a visiting prefectus from the capital, and an aging legal officer with sunken eyes and a voice like dust. No one dared whisper. No one dared blink too long. Marcus stood among the crowd of soldiers gathered as witnesses. He wasn't on trial. Not yet. But everyone in the room knew that truth in Rome was often less about facts and more about who believed whom, and why. The first man brought forward was a standard-bearer named Sextus Rutilius, young brash, once overly proud of his connection to a minor senator in Rome. He looked terrified now, trembling before the tribunal. They grilled him on his night postings, his conversations with Gauls in nearby villages, his letters home. He denied everything. Then came Flavius Corvinus, a former tax clerk turned legionary, older than most, quiet, methodical. The questioning turned cold with him. They'd found a scrap of parchment in his quarters, a cipher, a list of Roman supply depots, coded in Greek. Flavius said nothing. They took him away. No one saw him again. That night, Marcus sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the candle's flicker like it held answers. Gaius sat nearby, polishing his armor with a slow, almost distracted rhythm. "You think Corvinus did it?" he asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. He was too smart to be careless. "That parchment?" It was too obvious. Then someone planted it. Someone wants us divided, scared, and it's working. Gaius sighed, drained the last of his watered wine, and said nothing more. The next day, the tribunal shifted tactics. They began asking not about betrayal, but about loyalty. Who still believed in Rome? Who spoke against the Senate in private? Who joked about Nero's madness or whispered that Britannia was a mistake? That was the trick. They weren't just hunting a traitor anymore. They were testing every man's faith. And then it happened. Marcus was summoned. He walked into the granary-turned courtroom with his head held high, but his stomach twisting like rope. Lucullus nodded solemnly. The visiting prefectus never looked up from his wax tablet. The legal officer began the questioning. They asked about his scrolls, his correspondence, his time in Hispania, the day of the ambush, his relationship with Gaius. The tone sharpened when they asked why Marcus had been near the supply tent 2 nights ago, exactly when the second soldier vanished. He explained, "I was looking for spare caligae. Mine were damaged." They didn't write that part down. Then came the question that made his blood run cold. "Do you believe the glory of Rome is worth any price?" He paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't sure what answer they wanted. "Yes," he said carefully, "but not at the cost of honor." The legal officer glanced up. Lucullus's jaw clenched. They dismissed him without a word. He walked out of that granary with the strange, hollow feeling of a man who might not be free tomorrow. That night, he couldn't sleep. He paced the barracks, listened to the breath of sleeping comrades, watched the moon rise over the spiked palisade. And he thought about Rome, about the Senate, about power built on fear and silence, about how legions could win every war abroad and still lose the one within. Just before dawn, Gaius found him at the edge of camp. "You were right," Gaius said grimly. Corvinus didn't do it. He was framed. Marcus turned sharply. "How do you know I found this in Lucullus's tent?" He pulled out a crumpled scrap of paper. It was a copy of the cipher, but with notes in Lucullus's own hand showing exactly how to plant it, not decode it. Why, Marcus whispered. Because Lucullus needed a scapegoat. He lost men in the ambush. He needed someone to blame someone expendable. Corvinus had no family, no patron in Rome. Easy target. Marcus stared at the fire pit, fury rising in his chest. "So what do we do?" Gaius looked at him with eyes darker than the night. "We wait, and we remember. One day, Rome will fall not from the outside, but from the rot inside her walls. We can't stop that, but we can survive it." And so they waited. The orders came at dawn. Marcus and Gaius were summoned by a junior tribune, barely more than a boy in polished bronze, and handed a scroll sealed not with Lucullus's mark, but the emblem of the governor in Mogontiacum. No explanation, no salute. Just an order report to Outpost 17, 2 days east through forest and swamp. Escort a supply convoy. Secure the area. Report findings. Standard mission, perhaps. But both men knew better. Outpost 17 was cursed, not in the sense of omens or spirits, but in the cruel Roman way, a place where inconvenient men were sent to be forgotten. It was said to be undermanned, undersupplied, and surrounded by tribes who had never signed treaties, only sharpened spears. Still, they obeyed. Disobedience meant disgrace, and disgrace meant chains or a blade. They departed before noon, with a handful of men veterans quiet, watchful. Among them was Varro, a Gaul, with a scar across his jaw. Livius, a stoic archer, who spoke more with his eyes than his tongue. And Junius, the medicus, whose laughter always came too late. The forest swallowed them quickly. Trees stood like columns of an old forgotten temple. Mist clung to their boots. The sounds of the world, the birds, the wind, even their own breathing felt muffled, as if nature was watching in silence. By nightfall, they made camp near a stream. The air grew colder. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling they were being followed not by men, but by intention. Like the gods had turned their gaze toward him, and didn't blink. Around the fire, Varro leaned in. "This isn't a supply run," he said in a low voice. Gaius nodded. "More like a burial mission." Marcus stared into the flames. "They want us out here because we know something. Something Lucullus doesn't want back in the capital. And if we don't die here," Livius added, "they'll make sure we do on return." No one argued. The next day, they reached Outpost 17, or what remained of it. The palisades were shattered. The gate sagged open. Blood stained the dirt. No bodies. No signs of a struggle. Just absence, as if the outpost had swallowed itself in shame. They entered with weapons drawn. Marcus led. Every creak of the wood, every flap of tattered cloth made the soldiers flinch. But there were no screams, no corpses, only silence. Inside the command tent, they found what they were looking for. A single scroll, signed by the former commander of the outpost, now missing. The message detailed supplies being siphoned off to private estates. Names were listed, including Lucullus. The corruption reached all the way to the Senate. Marcus read the final line aloud. "If this message reaches any Roman with a soul, let it burn through the lies like fire." Gaius took the scroll and placed it inside his tunic. "This is why they sent us," he said. "Not to deliver, but to bury this." That night the outpost felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by truth. The next morning, just before sunrise, Livius spotted movement on the ridge. A dozen figures, not tribesmen, Romans, but not from their cohort. Assassins. The ambush was fast. Steel met steel. Arrows cut through mist. Varro took a blade to the shoulder, but fought like a beast. Gaius shielded Marcus more than once. The medicus fell early. 2 men from their own group turned traitors bribed by fear. But Marcus held the scroll, and Marcus did not fall. When the skirmish was done, only 5 men stood, bloodied, shaking, alive. Gaius limped to Marcus's side. Still think this is just a supply run? Marcus didn't answer. He looked to the rising sun, and for the first time since enlistment, he questioned not just Rome's justice, but his place in it. The return to camp was slow-heavy with wounds and silence. Marcus and Gaius led what remained of their unit. 5 men who had fought off assassins, survived betrayal, and now carried a secret that could shatter a commander's career. Every step back felt like dragging chains of conscience. The forest, once ominous, now stood as the only witness to their loyalty or their defiance. 3 days passed before the walls of the Legion camp rose into view. From a distance, it looked the same banners, fluttering guards at the gates, the scent of ash from the smithy fires. But Marcus no longer saw a home. He saw a stage, a place where performances of loyalty were applauded and truth was punished. As they entered, a courier approached. "The legate requests your presence, immediately. No welcome, no congratulations, just a summons." The command tent was full. Lucullus sat behind a desk that looked more throne than table. 2 new tribunes flanked him, men from Rome with polished breastplates and unreadable faces. A small crowd of officers observed from the shadows. Marcus stepped forward, scroll still hidden beneath his tunic. Lucullus's voice was calm, too calm. "I heard there was an incident at Outpost 17. "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. "And the message, the commander's scroll." For a moment, everything froze. Gaius shifted behind him. One breath, one pause too long, and they'd be dead. Marcus reached into his tunic and pulled out a different scroll. The supply manifest. He had burned the other one the night before. Gaius had watched in silence, saying nothing, as flames consumed the words that could have changed everything. "We found only this," Marcus said, handing over the charred-edged parchment. "The outpost was abandoned. We buried the dead." Lucullus took it, examined it without reading. He nodded. "Then your mission is complete." A pause. "You're dismissed." As they stepped outside, the sky was clear. Too clear. The kind of sky that mocks the weight in your chest. Gaius finally spoke. "You burned it." Marcus nodded. "We give it to the Senate, they cover it up. We give it to a rival, we become pawns. We speak out, we die. And nothing changes." Gaius looked at him for a long time. "Then why are we still wearing this armor?" Marcus looked out over the camp. The rookies running drills, the medics hauling bandages, the veterans sharpening blades that would never rest. Because if even one man in this place still believes Rome can be more than fear and lies, I have to be there to protect him. And with that, they walked on. The story of Marcus wouldn't make it into the history scrolls. He would never be a general, never a statue. But somewhere between duty and survival, he chose to live with truth, quietly, fiercely, and with just enough hope to keep marching. When we imagine the Roman soldier, we often see a statue chiseled, unyielding, proud. But beneath the armor was always a man like Marcus. A man who woke up in the cold, marched through mud, fought not just enemies, but doubts, betrayal, and a system that rewarded silence more than virtue. The Roman Empire was built on discipline, power, and fear. But it endured as long as there were men who believed it could be more, who chose to carry both sword and conscience. Marcus never made it into the history books. His victories weren't carved into marble or sung in poetry. But maybe that's the real story of Rome, not of emperors and legions, but of the forgotten men who lived between the lines, who bled so the borders stayed intact, who doubted but still marched, who chose not glory, but decency. And as the centuries rolled on and empires rose and fell, the question remained, what makes a soldier truly great? Is it obedience or the quiet moments where he chooses humanity over command? Marcus never had an answer. He just kept waking up, putting on his armor, and walking forward. And maybe in the end, that was enough. When we imagine the Roman soldier, we often see a statue chiseled, unyielding, proud. But beneath the armor was always a man like Marcus. A man who woke up in the cold, marched through mud, fought not just enemies but doubts, betrayal, and a system that rewarded silence more than virtue. The Roman Empire was built on discipline, power, and fear. But it endured as long as there were men who believed it could be more, who chose to carry both sword and conscience. Marcus never made it into the history books. His victories weren't carved into marble or sung in poetry. But maybe that's the real story of Rome, not of emperors and legions, but of the forgotten men who lived between the lines, who bled so the borders stayed intact, who doubted but still marched, who chose not glory, but decency. And as the centuries rolled on and empires rose and fell, the question remained, what makes a soldier truly great? Is it obedience or the quiet moments where he chooses humanity over command? Marcus never had an answer. He just kept waking up, putting on his armor, and walking forward. And maybe in the end, that was enough. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you felt moved, inspired, or simply curious, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More forgotten voices from history are waiting to be heard.